Hey, good morning, Horizon Church. Good morning, Mom, Patrice, and anybody else that is plugged in. Good to see you this morning. Yeah, I finished. Want to chat about the book that I know I mentioned this on Sunday for those of you who maybe were either here or plugged in. The book, "The Sun Does Shine" by Anthony Ray Hinton. Finished the book yesterday morning, and a great book. Good morning, Carol. I know you've read this book as well. Carol, and I hope you guys will read this. I want to talk a little bit about how we change, and I want to talk about growth. A lot of times as Christians, a lot of our growth takes place in ways that aren't necessarily challenging to us. We learn things that we didn't know before. We have experiences that help us to grow, and our growth is not necessarily challenging, but I do think that there's a kind of growth that has to happen to all of us. It intentionally has to happen to all of us. The kind of growth that is challenging. It really messes with some of our core convictions. It messes with things that we have believed our entire life long. And that kind of growth is inevitable. And it's difficult. And sometimes we actually resist it. And I want to talk about that kind of growth, because if you're going to grow as a Christian, you're going to grow in your faith. That kind of growth is going to have to happen to you. It's been something that's been happening to me. I've been in a journey for a while, and Don and I were chatting about this book and some other things that we've been reading. And Donna knows that I have changed some of my convictions, and she recently said, yeah, she's with me. She agrees. And this book has helped me a lot. And I think it's a great book to talk about this kind of growth that happens. And just so you know, this kind of growth, it's the kind of growth that happens to people, even in the New Testament. You think about the Apostle Paul, who Paul was, for him to become a person of faith, for him to become a follower of Jesus, Paul's world was really turned upside down. His core convictions had to change, and that is not an easy thing for us to do. There's a great story in Acts chapter 10. The same kind of thing happened to Peter. And if you remember the story in Acts chapter 10, it's a great story. There's a Roman centurion, a guy named Cornelius, a Gentile, who is a person of pursuing God, and a godly man, a man really of faith. But he knew he needed to know more, and so God was going to send him to Peter for Cornelius to be discipled by Peter. Problem was that Cornelius is a Gentile, and there are so many things in the way of Jews and Gentiles interacting, and Gentiles becoming part of the faith. So there, in Acts chapter 10, there's this great story. Peter's on a rooftop, which sounds weird, but Peter's praying on a rooftop, which was a great place to play. Nice flat roof. You could be alone. And so Peter's up there praying, and he's hungry. And you may remember this story. He's hungry, and he sees a sheet being lowered from heaven, and on that sheet are all kinds of animals, unclean animals. And Peter hears this voice say, "Go ahead and eat. Take up and eat." And Peter absolutely objects, and he says, "Lord, I've never eaten anything unclean. I can't do this." And when you think about it, that's a conviction that Peter would have had all of his life. He would have grown up in the Jewish faith, and for him, it was just part of who he was. It went to his core that as a Jew, you obey the food laws, you eat kosher, and that's not an insignificant thing for Jewish people. It goes to really who they are. It goes to the core of their faith, that you maintain, eating kosher. But it's even more important than that. So this happens a couple times. It happens a total of 3 times. The sheet is lowered. He hears this voice, and he's troubled. Peter is really troubled, and he's puzzled, and he can't understand why this vision that he had, this experience, he does not get it. And of course, he doesn't change his opinion yet, but I think what's happened is like the door has cracked open for Peter, and it's just cracked open a bit. And there's in Peter's mind, there's this possibility of there is something going on here that I don't understand. Then there's a knock at his door. It turns out there's some people there saying, we're from Cornelius has sent us. He's a Gentile. He wants to meet you, etc. And Peter goes to his house. And one of the first things he says when he opens up the door, when Peter's invited in, Peter says, a Jew wouldn't come to a Gentile's house. But God has been at work in me. And see, there's the door cracked open. And Peter starts to feel unsettled. And then it's very private for him. It's going on in his brain, but then all of a sudden it becomes public when the door cracks open and Peter hears Cornelius's testimony of Cornelius saying, I had a vision from God, blah, blah, blah. And Peter realizes there's this great moment in Acts chapter 10 when Peter says, I see very clearly that God shows no favoritism. And he sees now, and his core convictions are just turned upside down. And Peter has to struggle and wrestle with the fact that this thing he has believed all of his life, he may have been wrong on some things, and he has to change them. And that kind of thing, that kind of change was necessary for Peter to grow. It's necessary for the church to grow, because God was arranging things so that Gentiles become equal partners in the church. But for that to happen, the men and women who were Jews, the original followers of Jesus, had to completely change their thinking and grow in ways that was unsettling for them. And that's the experience I've had over the last couple of years. And it was been cemented a while ago. So this book, and I hope you read it. The Sun Does Shine. It's about a guy named Ray Hinton, and this is not a spoiler because you can know this even if you have not read the book. But Anthony Ray Hinton is a guy who was totally innocent, and yet he was convicted of a crime, convicted of murder, and spent 29 years of his life on death row. 29 years of his life. And here's the amazing thing. When I started reading yesterday morning, I read probably a third of the book yesterday. I spent the whole morning reading the book. I had a house project. I was supposed to be outside painting windows, but I couldn't get myself to do it. Couldn't face it. Just because I was so worn out from the weekend. The weekend was brutal. So I told Donna, I said, I'll do it after lunch, but I just want to sit and read all morning. So I read the whole morning away, finished the book. But the interesting thing is, Anthony Ray Hinton, 29 years he spent in jail on death row. 50 some guys were executed on death row during the time he was there. 50 some times he had people on death row who were executed, and he's watching this knowing that he could get a date and he could be executed, and knowing that he was completely innocent of this crime. And for 14 years, for at least 14 of those years, he had so you're back, Estella. Good to have you back. I hope your trip to Gettysburg was great. Get to sleep in your own bed. It's always a good feeling when we get back. And can sleep in our own bed after all. But I hope you had a good trip to Gettysburg. But so for 14 years, he's fighting. And several times there would be, he'd make some kind of, his attorney would make some kind of an appeal. And in several cases, it would take years. It would take 3 years for the judge to rule on this one portion of the appeal. And if you can imagine sitting in jail, you're innocent. You didn't commit the crime, and you have to sit there for 3 years or longer just for one decision to be made before you can move on to the next stage. It's just a brutal experience for him. 29 years he spent on death row. But here's the thing. Here's what's changed for me. And my guess is that this is going to rattle the cage for some of you as well. For most of my life, being a good citizen and a moral guy and blah, blah, blah. Um, for most of my life, I grew up thinking that somebody who was arrested, somebody who was on death row, for example, in my brain, I'm thinking, well, I mean, I can accept the fact that maybe he was innocent of the crime. Maybe he didn't pull the trigger. But in my brain, I'm thinking the dude was at the wrong place, the wrong time. He had to be guilty of something if he ends up on death row. Maybe he drove the getaway car. Maybe he was best friends with the guy who did it. Whatever it was, I could not accept the fact that somebody could be on death row and be completely innocent. And that is the case of Anthony Ray Hinton, and actually the case of other people on death row. If you know those of you who saw the movie Just Mercy, there was another guy on death row with him who was also completely innocent of a crime that he was convicted of. Uh, Spent a couple years, I think 6 or 7 years, something like that, on death row before his release was run. There is no doubt, zero doubt that we have executed innocent people. Zero doubt that has happened. But in my brain, I have such a hard time wrapping my brain around that and struggled with that for years. So in my brain, I'm thinking, well, if the guy's there, come on, he did something wrong place, wrong time, hanging out with the wrong crowd. Maybe he was part of the group that was doing drugs and they got in trouble, whatever. But in my brain, that's how I thought about it. You do not get arrested if you're completely innocent, and you do not get convicted. You do not end up on death row if you're an innocent man. And I for a long time was a proponent of the death penalty. Be tough on crime, etc. And many of you still are. I know, those of you who are listening. It's some of us who are Christians will say, well, God was in favor of the death penalty in the Bible. So am I, simply because we believe that it's part of the Old Testament law. But I no longer am. And some of you will say, well, then maybe I'm not a supporter of police. Not at all. In fact, on Thursday, if you plug in on Thursday, I'm going to talk about a great book, 13 Days in Ferguson, that is all about a police officer. And it's a great book. And another book that you should read, and a good book about just a police officer who did just a fantastic job in his policing. And so, sometimes in our brains, we think, wait, is it possible for us to hold two really different ideas in our head at the same time? Is it possible for us to believe that our system is broken, that an innocent guy can end up on death row, and at the same time be a supporter of our police and our justice system? Of course it's possible. I know enough about justice systems around the world to know that, as flawed as art is, there's a lot that are a whole lot worse. And if I ever get in trouble, I'm glad I live in this country and live in this system. But let me share with you what the process that I went through, very similar to the process of that Peter went through when Peter was radically changed in Acts chapter 10. For me, I would describe the process this way, this process of growth. And I think that this is a process that God has had me on. Early on, quite a few years ago, it's like God just kind of cracked open the door for me. And for me, there was just this remote possibility that maybe I was wrong. It was not something I would have said publicly. It was very private, but the door just cracked open, and I thought, this is something that I need to think about more. I need to struggle with this. And in that struggle, most of the time I would land back where I was and where I was comfortable and what I believed for most of my life. And I would land there and I would live there. But it was like I describe it as a splinter in my brain, just this annoying thought that just maybe, and for me, that was that process. It started with the door cracking open, very much like Peter's experience. And Peter is having this vision, and he's resisting. He was saying, God, never, I would never touch this food. It's not kosher, never have, never will. but the door was cracked open. And the second part of the process is just being unsettled, just recognizing that, there is something here I need to pay attention to. I just don't know what it is. And that's the experience that Peter had too in Acts chapter 10, just being unsettled, just trying to figure out, why did I have this vision? What did this vision mean? And then recognizing that, man, this change is not going to be popular in my circle, my kind of conservative, evangelical, Bible believing circle. This is not going to be popular. And so you hold these beliefs privately, but you don't say much. And then, of course, finally, the last step, and this is what Peter went through as well, is that you recognize, no, I was wrong. I was wrong, and I need to change. And that becomes public. And you talk about it on things like YouTube. And that's where I am. And I know for me, it's been a process of growth. I know that it's something that God was doing. God was changing my life and growing me in really necessary ways. And so again, I'm not giving you any spoilers. I mean, you get the book, and on the jacket, you're going to read about a guy who spent 29 years on death row. So it's not as if there's any surprise in the book. And there are certain things I'm not going to tell you because I don't want to spoil the book for you, but I hope you read it. But I would say that there's a couple issues. I agree, Carol. Very hard, but very worth it. And I want to saw you plug in on thinking, well, I know you've been through the same kind of journey. But there are several things for me that in this book, and several things that are common that I've just had to admit. And I would say these are the things, and there's maybe more and maybe worth talking about it, but these are the things. This is how a totally innocent man who was not in the wrong place at the wrong time, the guy who was, in fact, he was at work. He was at work. He was in the right place, doing the right thing at the wrong time, at the right time. There are several things that were stacked against him that caused him to be arrested and convicted of a crime he had nothing at all to do with. One was race. Anthony Ray Hinton is a black man. He's a black man living in Alabama. And when he was arrested and convicted and et cetera, his race was an issue. That's a hard thing to admit. But it's true. He was a black man. And that contributed to how he could be convicted and found guilty of a crime he didn't commit and spend all that time in death row. The other issue is his poverty. And this is something I think we know, but we struggle with a little bit. In the book, once or twice, people say it is better to be rich and guilty than poor and innocent. And that's worth thinking about. In our system, it is better to be rich and guilty than it is to be poor and innocent. And you see how poverty really stacks the deck against you, and it's hard to get justice. When you read about his trial, when you read about his conviction, when you read about the appeals he had to go through, you see the difficulty of not having money. You can't afford expert witnesses and can't afford attorneys. An attorney gets assigned to you, but I have had that experience. I have had to have been a witness several times for various things as a pastor or because of my association with church. And the people for whom I was a witness or, witness against on one occasion tended to be poor people. And you could see that they're public defenders, probably very noble people who went into this for a good cause, but you could see that they were exhausted, they were overworked. And in one or two cases, I was asked questions that I was thinking, if you would have just talked to me for 3 minutes before you put me up on the stand, you would know that I'm going to have to answer this the wrong way. But these poor people, the public defenders, exhausted, overworked, they didn't have the opportunity to do that. So the deck is stacked against you if you are poor in our system. And then the third thing that's wrong, frankly, is the system itself. Um, there were certain instances when just because of the rules make the rules of the system, the court system, the process, the rules make it really, really difficult for you to get a second opportunity. I'll give you one example, and this isn't a spoiler, but in the system, and I don't know if this is true in every state. I don't know if it's true across the board, but if there was evidence introduced in your original case, then let's say you had an expert testify for you and the prosecutor had an expert testify against you. When you go back to appeal, even if you know that evidence was presented in the wrong way, because it was presented in your original case, you can't get a second hearing on that, because they'll say, well, we heard this evidence the first time, and the jury heard it and the jury decided. And so, you have situations where it's really, really difficult in the system to get a hearing, even if you're innocent. And even if you know that particular piece of evidence was presented in the wrong way and it was twisted and it needs to be reheard just because of the rules of the system, it's really, really difficult. So if you can imagine sitting in jail for 14 years when, you've already been there for 15 years. Now you have an attorney. Now you have somebody who's actually working on your case and working hard. But for 14 years, you sit there on death row knowing you're innocent, and waiting sometimes for 3 years at a time for just one decision. One decision. Can you imagine how brutalizing that would be? So for me, and again, for some of us, we struggle because we say, well, 22 minutes. We struggle because this rattles our cages and we really struggle with, but this isn't what I have believed all of my life. And my process that I went through is a process a lot of us go through. The door cracks open just a bit. And I think God does that just a bit. And we ask ourselves, is it possible? Is it remotely possible that I have been wrong? And then for a while we're unsettled and we struggle and we don't say a whole lot, but it's internal. And then we hold privately. We think, I think I was wrong, but I can't say this because it goes against the culture that I'm a part of. But then finally, whatever happens, maybe we hear other voices, whatever it is, and we're public. And that's been my experience. And that's how we change. That's necessary. It's necessary for you. It is necessary for you in certain instances if you are going to grow as a person of faith. That's the kind of thing that is going to happen to you, and it has to happen to you. Because of course we are not right about everything. We're wrong about certain things. This is a struggle we often have in the Bible. You ever have something in the Bible that you just think, nope, can't hold on to that. I can't believe that. I've had people say that a lot to me over the years. And I've often said to them, well, if you agreed with everything in the Bible, I'd be suspicious, because that would mean that you're God. The Bible on purpose is going to challenge us, and it's going to make us wrestle, and it's going to make us struggle, because it's what God does. So this kind of thing is necessary for you, and I would challenge you to think about things in your life where maybe God cracked open the door just a little bit and you start to think, is it possible that I've been wrong? And you're going to spend some time being unsettled, and on that settledness is a good thing. You're probably going to realize at some point, I no longer believe what I used to believe, and I believe this new thing, and you're going to hold it privately for a while. And then at some point, whether it's because you get linked up with other people or whether you just find courage or whatever. At some point, it'll be public, and God will have grown you, and it's a good thing. Happened to me. I hope you guys will read that book, not because I want you to land anywhere where I am, but just because it's a great book. It challenges us. It's worth thinking about. And then Thursday, when we plug in on Thursday, I'm going to talk to you about another book and some other things that I think God has been challenging me with and actually showing me in a really, really remarkable way. Some things I've learned about the kingdom of God. Talk about the book 13 Days in Ferguson, about a police officer. Great book. And you should read that one as well. So let me pray, and let me pray that God will be growing all of us, and that he'll be challenging us. And then I am sorry that I have talked for so long. So let me pray. God, thank you for today. Thank you that you grow us and you do challenge us. You change some of our core convictions. That's a necessary thing. God, I know that a lot of our growth occurs in ways that is just adding to what we already believe. Kind of like building blocks or Legos. You're building on things that we believe, and we're not necessarily challenged to our core, but we just grow. We learn more. We learn things that we didn't even know. And God, thank you for that kind of growth. But I also know, God, that if we are going to grow as human beings, if we're going to grow as Christians, if we're going to grow as followers of you, there are going to be some times in our lives when you challenge us to our core, when there are things that we have believed our entire life long, and we've been wrong. And we will have to admit that and change. God, I pray that you'll help us to be moldable and shapeable and transformable by you as we wrestle with things like this. I pray, God, that you would help us to never be so stubborn. God, I know for me, I've had to face this. Help us to never to be so stubborn that we refuse to be open to the possibility that maybe we were wrong about some things. And God, thank you for how you grow us and change us and make us more and more to be the people you want us to be. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Alrighty, guys, everybody, thank you so much for getting plugged in this morning. And love you all. My coffee's been waiting. Didn't get a chance to take a sip, but man, I am groggy this morning and I need my coffee. So have a great day. Love you all. And see you on Thursday. We'll talk about another book, 13 Days in Ferguson.